Well, thank you again. I'm Dani, if you hadn't already guessed. Thank you very much for having me here. This is my second time in Melbourne in about 3 weeks, and I think it's been about 3 years since I've been in Melbourne before that, so there we go. But I'm also very confused by the weather this morning. I've been spending all morning taking my cardigan on and off, so if I end up freezing and I sort of run off the stage, it's just to get my cardigan. I think I'll be fine though. I have a favourite cartoon. I forgot to put it in the PowerPoint slide, so you're just going to have to envision this in your head. I can't remember, I don't know where it originated from, but you may be familiar with it. It's a cartoon of a fishbowl. And in this little kind of round fishbowl, there is 2 fish on one side, and they're drawn in a way that you kind of work out they're the younger fish, okay? Then there's another fish on the other side of the fishbowl. You know he's older because he's wearing like this little jaunty senior's hat at a bit of an angle, and he looks a little rougher, a little older, seen a bit more of fish life. Anyway, he's swimming by these 2 younger fish, and he says to them, "Morning, boys, how's the water today?" And he swims past, and the 2 younger fish then look at each other and they go, "Water? What's water?" The idea being, these fish are immersed in this environment that they don't even know exists. It's just so much a part of their reality that this is the world they live in, and they aren't actually able to grasp hold of that world. To change metaphors from water, it's like the air that we breathe. To change metaphors again, to put it sort of in Christianese, it's what are we being discipled by? What actually is forming us as human individuals? So that's kind of, a bit of an insight into what we're going to be doing over the next 40 minutes or so, is exploring the landscape, the water we're living in, the air we're breathing, who and what and how we're being discipled by, particularly when it comes to the topic of sex and the self. I want to be honest and tell you that I'm actually kind of hoping to leave you all a little bit more confused by the end of this 40 minutes than you currently are. Because the topic that we're considering, sex and how it relates to a sense of self, and its pastoral implications for those who, particularly we're going to look at those experiencing same-sex attraction, it is complicated and it is complex. That's not because a biblically faithful sexual ethic is complicated or complex. It's not. I think Jesus' teaching on marriage and sex is fairly straightforward in that sense. But what is complex and what is complicated is the application of that teaching in the lives of real people, and in the landscape in which we're seeking to live out this biblical sexual ethic. As Victorians, I think you have a more immediate understanding than this Sydney-sider of just how complex the societal and the political landscape is regarding sexuality, and how it only seems to be becoming even more so, though we in Sydney are beginning to catch up with you on that as well. But as complex and as challenging as the broader societal and political context of this discussion both is and continues to become, the pastoral context is just as complex and just as challenging, and only becoming more so. And so when I say I want to leave you a little bit more confused than you are, I mean that it's my goal to help you understand the complexity of this topic, of this landscape more broadly, and particularly as you pastor those in your congregations who may be themselves same-sex attracted, or who may have family members and friends who are same-sex attracted. Because recognising the complexity of all of this is actually, I think, one of the most crucial first steps in faithfully loving and discipling these sheep who have been entrusted to your care. We need to have some grounding of the terminology, of the concepts, of the history, of the meaning, of the landscape which our people are immersed in, surrounded by, seeking to navigate, and which those in our communities outside the church that we're seeking to evangelise are also immersed in. We need to become ever more aware of this strange new world that we find ourselves in, and we need to understand its ruling assumptions, what's going on beneath the surface, so that we can help those in that world see how the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ shines right through it and across it. So that's the plan for this session. We're going to wind our way through this confusing and complex landscape, or actually two related landscapes. Firstly, we'll explore the broader ideological and sexualised landscape of the society around us in Western 21st century Australia. And then secondly, we're going to take our insights from that landscape of the world, but also I think the church in many ways have been deeply formed by this as well. We're going to take what we've learned about how the world and the church thinks about sex and the self, and then we're going to keep them in mind as we explore the contemporary evangelical landscape about same-sex attraction. I've got a clicker. Let's see if I have to point at the back, I imagine. There we go. So we're going to start with the ideological landscape of the 21st century Western sexualised individual. How's that for a mouthful for you? To explore this vast landscape, we're actually going to take ourselves on a tour guide. We've got a tour guide who'll help us through this, and that's Carl Trueman. I don't know if you've read or come across Carl Trueman's two most recent, well, probably not his most recent now, but two very good books, I think, in so many ways. The first is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's, 400 pages long with a million footnotes. I actually listened to it on audiobook the first time around and then went back to actually read it, which made the reading an easier go. But then there's also The Strange New World, which is his kind of Reader's Digest version. So Trueman's basic thesis about the self and sex is this. Oh, sorry, I've gone back too far already. You shouldn't trust me, one of these. Okay. Sexual desire has emerged in the last 100 years as a primary category for understanding our identity. In biblical times, or in ancient Greece, sex was regarded as something that human beings did. Today, it's considered to be something vital to who human beings are. Used to be what we did, now it's who we are. And so in both of his books, Carl Trueman traces through how the way we think about the relationship between sex and the self today hasn't just kind of sprung out of nowhere. We've kind of woken up and gone, oh, this is where we are now. Actually, it's been forming step by step for a very long time. In fact, Trueman argues that it's been happening for at least 400 years. I actually think it's probably been happening for a little bit longer, but we can talk about that later. The culminative result of each of those steps taken over the last 4 or so centuries is that as 21st century Westerners, we now find ourselves grappling with a genuinely unique context and a truly distinct set of convictions about who we are as people, which deeply inform the way we think about who I am as an individual person. That is, we live in a world today which has a very distinctive, unique, and in many senses genuinely unprecedented anthropology. And it's an anthropology in which sex is absolutely central. So Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, is, as I said, about 400 pages long. The length and the depth and the complexity of his argument means I can only give you the sort of top-level highlights at the moment. But I think they're enough for us to trace the development through and just kind of get the big picture. So let's do that. Let's trace through this development of the modern self step by step. And the first step is the psychological self. Yeah. The psychological self, Trueman talks about as arising through the Enlightenment period of the 18th century and coming about through the works of various thinkers and philosophers. And these thinkers and philosophers began to argue that a person's ultimate sense of identity is to be found through their sense of inner biography. That the way to understand who we are is by turning inward and investigating who we perceive ourselves to be. Now, that might sound rather mundane to us in 21st century Australia, but in its time it was not in the least mundane. It was very new, it was very novel, because it represented a real movement away from the formation of identity as part of a broader network of relationships and communities. Prior to this time, who you were, what you did, who you married, where you lived, what life path you were expected to take, what work you did, all of it, your sense of self kind of as a holistic idea was very heavily not just influenced by, but at times determined by the community in which you lived, the relationships in which you were involved. Your identity was corporately formed. The psychological self began to diminish that. It began to insist that our identity is not so much formed by anyone else outside of ourselves, but according to philosophers like Rousseau and others, each individual becomes the authoritative discoverer of their own identity. The self becomes psychologized. And then the psychologized self becomes romanticized. So the next step occurred in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and it happened amongst quite a different cultural group than the academic philosophers and thinkers. Think of the famous romantic poets like Shelley and Wordsworth, all those people that you were forced to read in Year 11 English, those guys. The Romantics essentially take the intellectual arguments of the Enlightenment, the kind of, fancy ideas that all these philosophers are talking about, and they make them accessible and applicable to the masses. In other words, they take the philosophical ponderings about the psychological self, they remove it from kind of the academy, and they make it relevant to the ordinary everyday person. In particular, they concluded that a person's sense of morality and therefore their sense of self was to be primarily determined by feelings. This is kind of the romantic nature of this. I know what's right because it feels right to me. I know I'm living rightly because it feels like this is what it is for me to live rightly. Notice the inward lookingness of it. The Romantics very definitely built upon the notion of the psychologized self, but they emphasised the place of feelings for the psychologized self. And Truman identifies this as the beginning of what he calls a therapeutic anthropology. That is, the birth of an anthropology which reads that the purpose of being human is to essentially feel good, to have our perceived desires for happiness met, to chase personal fulfillment. The therapeuticized person is concerned with being true to who they sense themselves to be, based on their own feelings, their own perceptions, their own emotions and desires. So we have the psychologized self who forms their identity from within rather than without. That's then built on by the romantic self who pursues identity formation based on what feels good to it, all of which means that the self needs to be able to respond to what's going on inside us. We need to do that with a kind of flexibility and an agility. And Truman talks about this being the plasticized self. That is, the self needs to be able to follow your inner voice and feelings. It needs the ability to be flexible and changeable in its formation, in its response to how it perceives itself to be. This is the plastic self. It's the commitment to an anthropology in which human nature is not fixed, but can be made and remade depending on the circumstances, the culture, the context in which that self is located. And most importantly, depending on the self's own sense of internal convictions and beliefs and emotions. So the plastic self is ever evolving, ever progressing. It's never static. It's always at least able to be dynamic. Which then brings us to the next step in the identity formation timeline, and that is the sexualizing of the self. Now, this is where Freud enters the picture. A lot could be said about Freud. I'm not going to say very much at all, but essentially, he places the sex drive, the libido, at the very core of what it means to be human. and in fact what it means for you to be the human being you are. So here is what one author says about Freud's impact. Before Freud, sex was for procreation and pleasure. Now it's for who we really are. The happiest person is the one who is able to constantly indulge his or her sexual desires. So Freudian thought, and yes, Freud's kind of at the forefront of this, but then there's a whole kind of industry that comes up behind him. Freudian thought takes sex and it places it as the ultimate authority of the psychological self. It's the authoritative guide within which says what feels good, and this is what feels good, is therefore what should be done. Our experience of sexual desires, longings, instincts and so on, they are the authority around which we make and remake ourselves. I recently read an observation which I think shows us the depth to which the self has become sexualised in our society in this way. An author named Alan Duty says, sex isn't something we do anymore, it's who we are. This is evidenced by the way that the labels straight, gay and bisexual make sense even when applied to people who have never engaged in sexual activity. So, for example, teenagers, even children who have not yet had sex, are encouraged by our society to identify themselves as being gay or straight. This isn't based on anything they've actually done, but on what sexual desires and inclinations they might find themselves experiencing, on their sense of who they are. And we all know that our sense of who we are when we're a teenager is a very confused one. So, the self is determined by looking within, doing what feels right and good, ever able to be shaped and moulded to achieve those aims. And the ultimate way in which all of this is achieved is through the freedom to pursue our own sexual instincts. Which means that the next logical step was for the sexual self to become politicised. Let me explain what that means. If our sexuality is the primary key to personal identity, personal purpose, personal fulfilment, then each of us needs to be free to pursue that. If we're not genuinely free to be able to explore and express our sexual selves, to live out our what we determine to be our authentic self, then we are being victimised. We are being oppressed. This means that sex is no longer a personal or a private thing. It has become a political thing. To be an authentically sexual self requires you to be freed from any structures or any systems which would seek to restrain or stop you from expressing your sexuality as you see fit. And in this context, any communal sense of sexual morals or codes are considered to be strategies used by those who are in power to keep their power and to stop other people from having the freedom to be who they truly are. So let me give you an example. Think of what is now Pride Month in certainly Australian culture. The Pride March, the first one, began as a way to memorialise the 1969 Stonewall riots, which themselves started as political protest by gay activists in the US. The first Pride March in New York City in 1970 was a political demonstration. And it continues to be that today, just now all around the world and for a full month rather than a march. It's not merely a social gathering of people who kind of share similar interests and convictions and who enjoy each other's company. It's a political activity with political intentions and political ramifications. A few years back, the theme for Sydney Pride Festival was this: be you. It's the perfect encapsulation of what we've been looking at, the perfect end result of each and every one of those steps that the self has taken over the last 4 centuries or so. The self was psychologized, the self became romanticized, the romanticized self became necessarily plasticized, the plastic self becomes sexualized, and then the sexualized self embraces its necessary politicization. So we might summarise the end point of all of this in this way. Desire for inner happiness and psychological well-being lie at the heart of the modern era. It's now accepted that the way you see yourself, your inner image, is the true you. This even takes precedence over one's own body. However, for one's identity to flourish, it must be acknowledged by others. That's the water we're swimming in. Now, let me just offer a couple of brief caveats before we go on. Firstly, we need to recognise that not every single aspect of that kind of progression that we just went through was toxic. Okay? There are some important theological matters for us to reflect on in this discussion, such as the dignity of the human person, of the individual human person, that God has made us all unique, that we are creatures who do responsively engage with change and context, that sexuality is a fundamentally key aspect of what it means to have been created as a human being as opposed to something other than that. That feelings and emotions and desires are real and deeply felt, even as we recognise they are deeply impacted by sin. So we need to recognise that this is not just all terrible bad news with no foundation whatsoever of truth there. Secondly, and I think very importantly, we need to recognise that the church does not stand outside of all of this. It hasn't been like Christians went to sleep a few centuries ago and then woke up like Sleeping Beauty and kind of went, wait, where are we? What's happened here? I don't recognise this alien landscape. Throughout the centuries, Christians, the church, we have been complicit in fostering and promoting this kind of anthropology in all sorts of different ways. In fact, I think Truman's argument could have been, this wasn't his agenda. He was looking at kind of the secular unfolding, but I think his argument for the sake of a Christian readership would have been really well served by exploring the sense in which Christians have been an active part of this. For example, I think if we go back even further historically, from the Enlightenment to the Reformation, and we look at the significance of the Reformation for a sense of self, and most importantly, for promoting the idea that sex is a basic human need, then actually we begin to see that theologically we have partly laid the groundwork for a lot of this. It's our inheritance. Those caveats aside, as we survey the broad ideological landscape in which we seek to minister and lead and disciple, we need to understand just how important all of this is for the way we collectively as a society, but also then as individuals, have learnt to think about what it is to be a self and the role of sex in that. We have to understand both the way that we as disciple makers and those we are discipling understand sexuality, sexual orientation, sexual desires, sexual expression, sexual activity, to not just be what we do, but we're told it's about who we are. We live in a time and a place which insists that our sexuality is the self. So, with that very quick journey through 400 years of history, and with that broad landscape in mind, we're going to now turn our attention to a more defined part of that landscape, the landscape of same-sex sexual attraction. Such a mouthful, same-sex sexual attraction. I'll probably just refer to it as same-sex attraction within the evangelical church today. Okay, so we're going to look at the evangelical landscape and same-sex sexual attraction. I've argued that we Christians have to varying degrees, been discipled by a world that has asserted our sexual desires, instincts, longings lie at the core of who we are. That being able to express these sexual instincts is key to personal human fulfilment. The result of this, or at least one result, there's many results of this, but one result of this has been that our brothers and sisters in Christ who experience same-sex attraction have done that in a church that has for decades, even centuries, come to idealise and at times idolise marriage and romance and sex and put them as central to a Christian sense of identity and flourishing. Now, we can discuss to what extent that has or hasn't happened, where, when, why and how, but my point is that to some extent or another it has happened in our churches. We have helped to create this landscape, and so it's incumbent upon us to truly understand that landscape as we seek to walk alongside our brothers and sisters who experience same-sex attraction in our churches. I think there is a tendency amongst evangelical ministry leaders, myself included, to have quite a binary approach to the topic of Christian sexual ethics, especially as it relates to same-sex attraction. That is, we typically think you either affirm same-sex sexual relationships or you don't. And we don't, rightly so. So that's the end of the story. What else is there to say? It seems pretty straightforward. But actually, the men and women in our churches who experience same-sex attraction and who are seeking to live that out in faithful celibacy or perhaps in a what is often called a mixed orientation marriage, are nonetheless grappling with questions and with concepts and with challenges that feel far from straightforward for them. Even as they're committed to a biblical sexual ethic, there is so much complexity going on inside them still. And let me say this up front, there are men and women in your congregations, in your ministries, who experience same-sex attraction. Here are some of the latest statistics. 7% of men and 14% of women experience some degree of attraction to their own sex. But only 1% of men and only 2% of women are exclusively attracted to their same sex. You know, statistics, there's going to be whatever survey you look at, it's going to tell you slightly different things. But this is the broad shape of the latest data. Now, this data means a few things. If these societal statistics have any continuity in our churches, and they're going to have at least some, we hope they have at least some, because this is a society we want to be reaching with the gospel and welcoming into our churches. If there is some continuity, then you are likely to have significantly more women who experience same-sex attraction in your church than men who experience it. If you can think of a person in your congregation who is exclusively same-sex attracted, well, for that person, there are another 6 people in your congregation who experience some level of same attraction to people of their own sex, even as it's not exclusive to that. That means there are going to be married men and women in your church or your ministry who experience same-sex attraction to one extent or another, but who are married to a person of the opposite sex. In fact, they're likely to be the majority of people who experience same-sex attraction in your church. This is not just a topic that's about the long-term singles or the people you're aware of who experience same-sex attraction. The pastoral dimensions of this are bigger, I think, than we realise. There are a lot of Christians in our churches who are trying to navigate their way through this, and they're often doing it under a cloak of secrecy and silence. And they're doing that as Christians, immersed in water, in a fishbowl of the world around them that is constantly screaming at them that they cannot be true to themselves unless they embrace their desires and express them. Those men and women have questions. They're trying to work through this. And let me tell you, there are plenty of people within the evangelical church more globally who say that they have the answers that these people are looking for, particularly younger people. Think sort of Gen Zs, even millennials, who spend a lot of their time on social media, listening to podcasts. I was about to say reading books. Hopefully they're still reading books. Attending conferences, the influencer idea. There will be people in your churches and ministries, particularly younger people's, who are turning to those people in other places around the world for answers. They'll be following them on social media. They'll be listening to their podcasts. They will hopefully be reading at least some books. They'll be attending various conferences. Some of those you're pastoring are being deeply shaped and formed by people you may never have heard of or even aware exist. And these people, these kind of, let's just say influencers or leaders or people who kind of have a particular focus on this area of Christian life, they are literally taking sides, okay? Let me explain what I mean by this. The Christian same-sex attraction discourse is now one characterised by quote-unquote sides. Come with me. Don't get too caught up on trying to memorise and grapple with the fine details. I just want to give you kind of the shape of how complex this all is, okay? There is side A, side B, side X and side Y. This is the actual terminology that many same-sex attracted Christians, particularly those who are of a younger generation, or those who might refer to them instead of themselves as same-sex attracted, they may choose to refer to themselves as LGBTQ Christians. This is a terminology that many of them have adopted and are using to describe themselves within this conversation. This is their language. It all began back in the 1990s in an online discussion forum, which started using the side language as a neutral way of trying to encapsulate two different positions amongst Christians on homosexuality. At that time, in the early days, there was just two sides. So there was side A, who held that the sex of the partners in a relationship or sexual act does not affect the moral status of the relationship or the act. That is, in other words, go for it. Those who held to a side B position, and remember this is probably coming from cassette tape, side A, side B, this is where it's all, remember back in those days, this is where it's all coming from. Those who held to a side B position believed that same-sex relationships and sexual acts are immoral and or they fall short of God's ideal. In other words, don't go for it. So broadly speaking, those Christians who call themselves side A affirm same-sex relationships, including marriage, as being consistent with faithful Christian discipleship. In fact, a helpful memory hook, if you want to sort of get familiar with this language, is side A equals affirming, A affirming. Side B Christians contend that same-sex relationships are inconsistent with faithful Christian discipleship. They believe that Christians who experience same-sex attraction are called to either remain celibate and unmarried, or, if they're not exclusively same-sex attracted, marry someone of the opposite sex. Though the quote-unquote mixed orientation marriages, I think, is becoming a little less of a popular, encouraged course of action, and we can talk a bit more about that today. To help ground this for you maybe a little bit more, let me give you some names of some people who might fall into two of these broad categories. Don't worry if you don't know or recognise any of them. You don't need to, but in case you do, let me just give you a bit of the landscape. So side A, we've got people like Robert Song, Joel Hollier, who is a Sydney guy, Matthew Vines, Karen Keane, William Loader, and Richard Hayes. This is something just actually to be aware of. Richard Hayes, some of you may know, is a very prominent, preeminent New Testament scholar. He has a book coming out that he's just written with his son Christopher Hayes, called The Widening of God's Mercy, which explains why he has changed his position from being non-affirming to affirming. So this book is just coming out. I was just listening to a podcast that was reviewing it this morning. And the idea is that essentially the widening of God's mercy, God changes his mind and widens who's included, I think is the very broad kind of summary of that. So that's kind of just a few, this is not exhaustive, just a few names that you might recognise. Side B, we're talking about side B at the early point, okay? When we're just talking about the binary affirming and non-affirming sides, we would put people like this in that list, or they would put themselves in this bucket. Wesley Hill, Greg Johnson, Greg Coles, Nate Collins, Preston Sprinkle, whose podcast I was just listening to this morning, David Bennett, who's an Australian living in the UK, Sam Albury, Ed Shaw, who's in the UK, Vaughan Roberts, who's in the UK, Rachel Gilson, she's got a great book called Born Again This Way, Rebecca McLaughlin, she's got a million books, you may have heard of her, Christopher Yuan and Rosaria Butterfield, who you also may have heard of. But don't get too used to that list under side B, okay, because this is where things are about to get a lot more complicated, right? Don't get too worried about the details, just again come with me on a broad shape here. While side A has remained fairly consistent over the last 20 years or so, though there are occasionally people who move from side B into side A, doesn't tend to happen the other way around. Over time, the side B position, the non-affirming position, has become much more nuanced. In fact, side B has splintered, so that now we have side A, then we have side B, side Y, and side X. Side B, Y, and X all hold to a traditional Christian sexual ethic, but they actually have significantly different views on a range of other important aspects of this discussion. So, what is the difference between these three non-affirming sides B, Y, and X? Well, the best way to see this is to play it out through a series of diagnostic questions and each side's answer to these questions. Now, this is again where I remind you that it's okay to find this all a bit confusing. My point in speaking to you about it today is to help you be aware of just how complex it is, but to also be aware that these are the questions that people in your church are going to be wrestling with and are going to be hearing people talking about from these different sides, even as they may not know these sides exist. So let me show you what I mean by using a table that comes from a side B resource that is a few years old now. It's called 4 Views on Christian Sexuality. This is the first diagnostic question. Is sexual intercourse between two people of the same sex blessed by God? The first diagnostic question is whether people who identify as belonging to that side affirm same-sex marital and sexual relationships. And that's, again, fairly straightforward. We've just looked at that. Side A says yes. Side B, Y and X are united by saying no. But then with the next question, we start to see things becoming a bit more complicated. The next question is sexual attraction to the same sex in and of itself sinful? We've said that sexual activity is sinful. Same-sex sexual activity is sinful, but is the attraction that you feel to someone of your own sex in and of itself sinful? This is the first of a few questions that sit at the crux of the whole same-sex attraction discussion today in evangelicalism. In fact, I would go so far as to say that this is the key question at the moment, and the others kind of flow out from this. Is sexual attraction to the same sex in and of itself sinful? If you want to frame this question through a theological lens, then it's about a doctrine of concupiscence. If you want to understand what it looks like from the ground, well, this tweet from a leader in the Side B movement, I think, sums up the diagnostic question quite well. He says, I only black it out because I don't want to put people's names as kind of, this is what the ideas we're engaging with rather than the people. In my experience, the question, do you believe being LGBTQ plus is good, is a lot more clarifying than what do you believe about sexual ethics. The former question has revealed far more shared hope, vision and values even across ideological lines than the latter. So this Christian person who experiences same-sex attraction is not so much interested in a theological debate on concupiscence or even a discussion about what a faithful Christian sexual ethic is. The question that he thinks is the most helpful and clarifying is whether being gay, LGBTQ, is good in and of itself. Because remember what we discussed, sex is not about what you do, it's about who you are. This is the world we live in. And so he and other same-sex attracted Christians are still left asking if their experience of being sexually attracted to the same sex is a sinful thing, is a neutral thing, or perhaps is a good thing. Side A obviously says, of course it's not sinful, it's a blessing. But the list of people who fit in kind of that broad side B bucket all begin to shuffle into different columns at this point. So side B, as it now stands today, 2024, typically says that feeling attracted to people of your own sex is not in and of itself sinful. It is only sinful to act on that attraction. So some within side B would say today that the attraction is neutral. They might say it's disordered, but it's a neutral thing that you yourself experience. It's neither good or bad. It is what it is. It's sinful for you then to act upon that. But there are others within the side B movement, and I think this is probably the increasing number now, who say that that attraction can actually be a positive, good thing because it marks you out as different, and that difference is an important way for God's glory to be revealed. Okay, so that's kind of side B's trying to work out what they think about this, but it's at the very least neutral, possibly good, the attraction itself. Side Y would generally say that whenever someone experiences attraction to a member of their own sex, they are not themselves actively, intentionally sinning in that moment, but that the attraction itself is sinful. Let me explain what I mean by that, because it can be a little bit difficult to grasp this. This is the doctrine of concupiscence. You've got to get our heads around it. You know, as an Anglican, I would say this, but I think the 39 Articles of the Anglican religion is helpful here. Article 9 on original sin, I encourage you to read the whole thing, but the last sentence says, "The apostle doth confess that concupiscence and lust hath of itself the nature of sin." So that is side Y would say something like, you're not actively sinning each and every time you experience attraction to someone of your own sex. So you don't need to spend your whole life actively confessing and repenting and feeling shamed about every moment of attraction that you experience. But that attraction has of itself the nature of sin. And so it's something to be lamented rather than something to be thought of as neutral, let alone positive. Side X is much clearer. Side X says that every instance of attraction to someone of your own sex is itself an act of sin. It needs to be confessed and repented of, and your goal as a Christian is to no longer experience that attraction ever again. Your journey of sanctification as a Christian will necessarily involve you gradually conforming your desires so that they're only desires for people of the opposite sex. That brings us to two final diagnostic questions that flow out of this one. What should be the goal for a Christian with same-sex attractions? Well, side A says, find a spouse of the same sex. Side B and side Y say, live as a celibate person or perhaps in an opposite-sex marriage, though again, side Y is more likely to say the opposite-sex marriage than side B. Side X is very clear. They need to change their attractions and they need to find a spouse of the opposite sex. Which then brings the next diagnostic question. Can and should a person with same-sex attractions pursue changing their attractions in a proactive way through something like therapy or interventions? Now, notice here how the alignments have shifted. On this question, side A and side B, the affirming and non-affirming sides are in agreement. No, this should not be done because it's harmful and it's dangerous. Side Y says it's not endorsed, but it can be an option, and side X says, yes, it's to be encouraged. Now, actually, those words that I've got you there are from that resource I mentioned, from a side B website. It's a few years old now. I actually think it's out of date. I think on this question, the landscape has shifted over the last few years. It now looks something more like this. Side A and B haven't changed. Side Y would say it's not endorsed, it can be an option, but be very cautious about what damage it can do psychologically. Side X no longer says it's encouraged, they say it's necessary. So, here you can see that side A and side B actually end up sharing much more in common with this question than side B does with its other non-affirming counterparts. And side X fundamentally disagrees with everyone else on this. So remember our list of names from earlier? That list would look something more like this now. Side A remains basically unchanged. Side B, you've got people like Wes Hill, Greg Johnson, Greg Coles, Nate Collins, Preston Sprinkle, David Bennett. Revoice is it's a big US conference for same-sex attracted LGBTQ Christians. They are kind of the side B community, or the face of the side B community. Side Y, let me say, I think that the people that I've got on the screen there would be the first to tell you that they don't like using these labels to describe themselves. There's kind of been a bucket they've been siphoned into, but it's kind of a bit helpful to distinguish where they are theologically between side B and side X. So you'd have people like Sam Aubrey, Ed Shaw, Vaughan Roberts, Rachel Gilson, Rebecca McLaughlin. And then in side X, you would have people like Christopher Yuan, Rosaria Butterfield, Beckett Cook, just a sample. The interactions between these sides is becoming increasingly fraught. And the reason I'm telling you all this is not just an interesting intellectual exercise. This is what people in your pews are going to be wrestling with, even as they may not know that this is actually they may not know the sides, they may not know the names, but they're feeling this if they're engaging outside of their own context with the broader discussion. So it's becoming increasingly fraught. Even as those in side B remain non-affirming, many of them are increasingly feeling like they have more in common with people who fit into side A, because like side A, they don't think a gay orientation is a bad thing. And that's really important for these people, because remember, this is seen to be about who they are. So it's not just a question, is your same-sex attraction in and of itself sinful? They've been brought up in a world that tells them their attractions are who they are. And so that question is a very significant one for them, because it's about their identity. Are you saying that I am there's nothing good about my sexuality, that every instance of it is sinful? So side B is increasingly finding a sense of fellowship and even affection with side A because they have that in common. Meanwhile, side X, even just in the last year or so, is becoming very divisive, very dogmatic, very aggressive, very accusatory to anyone who does not 100% land on exactly where they are in every instance. They're particularly becoming very vocal on this idea that people who experience same-sex attraction, even those who are celibate, must seek for that to be changed, and they really ought to be getting married. Side Y is kind of left in the middle of all of this. They're trying to inject some nuance and some complexity into the conversation. They're trying to bridge interactions a little bit between side B and side X, but they don't go far enough for many people in the side B category. And those in side X just think and literally call them heretics and publicly condemn them. Now, if you're really confused, it's fine. It's kind of the point. Because if you're confused, imagine how confused the same-sex attracted young people in your church are as they get swamped by all of this in their social media feeds, on their podcasts, in the discussions they're having with friends. Most of us will be discipling, at least those in this room are likely to be discipling people who are same-sex attracted, who are already Christians, members of our church community, and who will be typically non-affirming of same-sex sexual relationships. We can't take that as a given, of course, but that's the likelihood for the people in this room that we're discipling. But what we need to realise is that in this present moment, the majority of those Christians in your church who you are seeking to lovingly and faithfully disciple are probably not wrestling with that primary question of whether they should have a same-sex marriage or not. They're likely to have settled on that, but they have a whole lot of other questions that they are wrestling with. We have to be aware of those questions so that we can disciple them in and through them. We have to think and understand what we mean by all this language of attraction and desire and orientation and temptation. We have to understand what God's word says about these things. Are they all the same? Are they all completely different? Do they overlap? In what sense do they overlap? We have to grapple with a reformed understanding of concupiscence and how that informs our thinking about sexuality and sin and sanctification. We have to consider, what are we discipling same-sex attracted Christians towards? Is it singleness? Well, do we have a theology of that? Do we have a community which celebrates and dignifies singleness? What are we calling them to, and how are we making that call an inhabitable call within our community? What language are we using to speak about their experience of same-sex attraction? What language are they using? What language do we want to encourage them to use? Why that language? Why not the other language? Why does that language communicate? What does that language communicate in the cultural landscape that we're in? What are the theological implications of that? It's really fraught. And what about those who are same-sex attracted and married to someone of the opposite sex? What theological and pastoral resources are we drawing on for them? Are we even aware that they exist? Remember, we live in a world in which sex is not primarily seen to be about what you do or do not do. We live in a world which says sex is about who you are. And so that's a question the people in our pews, whether they're opposite sex attracted or same-sex attracted, are wrestling with. Those who are same-sex attracted are wondering, what does that attractional patterns that I didn't ask for, I didn't cultivate, but I've not known anything other than this, what does that mean for who I am? What does it say about who I am? How does it impact the way I live as a Christian? As we disciple them, we need to hold steadfast to a faithful Christian sexual ethic, to Jesus' own teaching that God has created sex to serve the relationship between a man and a woman who are married. We need to keep teaching that. But discipleship of same-sex attracted Christian requires us to do more than just teach that. It requires us to recognise the theological and the pastoral complexity that lies at the heart of the intersection between the ideological landscape of the world around us and the Christian landscape about sex and the self. And most importantly, it requires us to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ to cut through and across and illuminate the place and the purpose of sex and how we as Christians understand what it is to be a self. I'm going to keep doing that across the course of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dani. I remember first year at college sitting my Doctrine 1 exam, and there was a question on concupiscence, and I'd never heard of the word before. So I proceeded to write an essay without understanding the question. Yes, anyway. As Christians, the Bible is our authority. It shapes what we believe and why. It reveals God to us. It shows us who we are as God's image bearers. But it's also really important for us to understand the landscape that we're living in. And I think Dani so helpfully had given us a summary of how things have reached the point that they have today over the last few centuries, and the way that thinking and philosophy and ethics has changed and evolved. That's really important. And it's also really important for us to grapple with the landscape that people in our congregations are wrestling with. They're facing what they're looking at online. Who are they listening to? What information has been fed to them? And some of it's good, and a lot of it is not so good. So thank you so much. I think that's really invaluable. Can we just go back to that list? I don't know every name on that list that Dani's mentioned, but some of them are familiar. And so over the years, I've made an effort to read people who are on that side A. So William Loade is a theologian I remember engaging with years ago. Side B, brothers and sisters, side Y. The side Y, if you're wanting to explore or listen to testimonies and to hearing the voices of people who are wrestling with these issues in a sort of a live, real sense, people like Sam Albury, Ed Shaw, Rachel, Rebecca, fantastic. They are wonderful Bible teachers, godly, men and women. So there are a few names that I highly recommend. But there's things to learn though from across that spectrum as well. So what I think we should do, just for 60 seconds, let's pause. Just think about some of the things that we've just been listening to. Maybe there is something that you need to talk to God about. Perhaps God is just helping you think through this and how we are loving the people under our care. So let us just pause for just a few moments if you want to pray or reflect, and then we'll have morning tea. Father, we thank you for the things that you're already pointing out to us today, the things that we are learning or being reminded of. Please help us to process these things throughout the day. May we not forget about them, but rather just write them down on our phones or in our hearts and minds, so that we can think about them and what it means as we seek to serve you in this world and to love the people around us. Amen.